This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Bill Kartalopoulos and Ben Katchor. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode I have the pleasure of talking with Bill Kartalopoulos and Ben Katchor. They are, respectively, the general editor and the guest editor of the 2017 volume of Best American Comics. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And since today, one of my guests is Ben Katchor, this would be a good opportunity for you to introduce yourself to Ben's work through Discount Comic Book Service. You can find his book, Hand Drawing in America, at 30% off of the cover price. And you can find the recent reissue of Cheap Novelties, Pleasures of Urban Decay, also at 30% off of the cover price. It's a great place to get your comics at wonderful discounts. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. It's been a tradition on the Comics Alternative that the penultimate episode every year is a discussion of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Best American Comics volume for that particular year. As listeners of the podcast know, for 2007, I was about to say this year, for 2007, we were a little late in getting that episode out. In fact, my co-host Paul Lai and I did that show early in January, and the reason that we were a little late in getting it out is due to life issues that got in the way, as we mentioned back then on the episode. Another thing that Paul and I had intended to do was to have both Bill Kartalopoulos, who is the general editor for the Best American Comics series, and Ben Katchor, who was the guest editor of the 2017 volume, on the show for an interview. Again, we weren't able to get them at that time toward the end of 2017, but I did want to talk with them about the 2017 volume because it's one of the ones that really stood out for me. Unfortunately, Paul was not able to join me for this interview, but I did have a wonderful time talking with both Ben and Bill, and I want to share that conversation with you now. I'm pleased to have back on the Comics Alternative both Ben Katchor and Bill Kartalopoulos. They are respectively the guest editor of Best American Comics 2017 and the general editor of the Best American Comics series from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Bill, Ben, both of you, welcome back to the Comics Alternative.
Hi, thanks for having us back.
Thank you. I'm here.
Yeah. Maybe we can start by me apologizing to both of you for having you on later than we had anticipated. As our listeners know, back in December, My co-host from back in December, Paul Lai, had a tragedy in his family and we weren't able to make the recording with you guys and publish it in late December as we had intended. But now I have you both on the show. Paul regrets that he is not able to make it, but he is with us in spirit. So I want to talk with you about the latest volume of Best American Comics, which came out last fall. Now, we reviewed it, I think, a few weeks ago for the podcast. And I have to say, from just a personal enjoyment point of view, this has to be the most engaging and intriguing and challenging volumes I've read of the Best American Comics.
That's good, I guess. Yeah, I think that's a good response. I heard that your review. I mean, it sounded pretty good, pretty aware of what we were trying to do.
And I know that every annual volume's editor brings in not only comics that, along with Bill, comics that most readers of comics may be familiar with, but also a variety of titles and creators that people may not have heard of at all. And Ben, one of the things that impressed me about the 2017 volume is the way that I guess you expanded or even challenged our understanding of what we call comics.
I'm interested in all kinds of text image work, whether you call it comics. There's even, I guess, stuff in here that's, you might also call it just illustrated text or annotated pictures. But yeah, it's that whole range interests me. I think trying to define comics would anyway make the whole field too narrow to interest me. So, and what's the point? I think the more you can fit into this kind of book that, there are all these other best of books are pure text. I don't think they have one of pure image, but this seems to be the one that's text image work. Mm-hmm. And until they start, I know they have that data visualization book now, right? Is that what it's called?
There was a Best American Infographics for
right.
2 or 3 volumes. I think I didn't notice it in the list of the 2017 volumes, which leads me to think that maybe it didn't. They didn't stick with that series. The publisher didn't stick with that series for whatever reason. I know nothing about that, so I couldn't tell you what the reasoning behind that might have been. But yeah, that was other than Best American Comics. That was the only visually oriented one. The Best American Info. I think it was Best American Information Graphics or Best American Infographics.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen a volume of that.
Mm-hmm. I think there were only 2 or 3. I don't see it, for example, on the list of Best American titles in the back of the Best American Comics that lists all the other titles in the series. So I guess it was an experiment.
Well, Bill, we've had you on the show a few times to talk about a particular year's volume of Best American Comics. And I know that in the past, I've asked you about the process, right? How you work with each guest editor. So I'm going to ask you again, and we have, I guess this is the first time this has happened, both you, Bill, the series editor, and that particular volume editor, Ben, in this case, on together. So let me ask not only you, Bill, but also you, Ben, as well. How did you guys coordinate? How was the work process in choosing what went into the 2017 volume?
Well, one thing I can say is that in the broad outlines, it's the same every year. We have we have an open submission policy. Anyone can send in their work. I receive, over the course of the year, constant packages from UPS with submissions for Best American Comics, and that's really great because it's a very democratic and open process. It can be, work that comes in from large publishers, or it can be, self-published work that is photocopied and hand stapled, and we treat that all equally. On top of that, of course, I also, extend myself beyond that submission process. I get in touch with publishers. I get in touch with self-publishing artists. I go to comic book stores. I go to comics festivals, just trying to amass a pool of everything that I think we should be looking at. Then I look at all of that material and send about 120 or so pieces to the guest editor, who looks at that material and makes final selections. And the guest editor also has, of course, the freedom to bring in some things that they may have found on their own. So in the broad outlines, that's consistent year to year. It's also consistent across pretty much all of the Best American titles. They all function that way, where there's a series editor working on multiple volumes, and there's a guest editor who comes in every year and makes the final selections. One difference in this case is that Ben lives in New York. We both teach at Parsons, actually. So there was a nice opportunity to have more face-to-face communication instead of packing up books into boxes and shipping them to the guest editor, as I often do. I was able to just haul them over to Ben's office in, sacks and tote bags and things like that. And on top of that, Ben, one thing that Ben was able to do that I think indicates, how seriously he took it was that he also was interested to see what I hadn't sent him. And Ben actually, came over to my apartment, where I have a gigantic Rubbermaid bins full of submissions, and he spent a day just kind of sitting on the couch and looking through that material just to really get a clear picture in his mind of what the field is. And then on top of that, as I said, guest editors always have the freedom to bring in some work that they found on their own, and I think, as you were alluding to before, and as you discussed in greater detail in your podcast review of the book, Ben didn't just bring in work he had found on his own. I think you could say he brought in an entire category of work that hadn't really been something that had been part of the purview of the series before, and really enlarged what we do in that way.
Right. Yeah, I went to a few comic festivals during the that period that we were looking at, and kind of very carefully looked at, I don't know how many 100 tables at various festivals, looking at work that I wasn't familiar with. And then there's a whole online world of comics that I tried to look into more deeply. And a lot of some of these strips, I think I saw them online. They may have existed in print, but I'd see the online version. I'm thinking of that big contest that Frank Santoro holds every year through his school. I found some pretty interesting stuff in there. So
I think the piece by Sienna Cittadino that's in the book came from your looking at that.
Yeah, and I sort of asked people that to recommend things that I might not have seen, and some things were brought to my attention in that way. But it's there's this amazingly large amount of work being done. I tried in my introductions to allude to that, the scale of the work done in this field now. Mm. And that's, like in 1950, if you asked people, who's writing poetry or who's writing short stories, you'd have millions of people saying yes. So it could be that large, but I don't have an exact number.
I think this is something that I had mentioned in some form or another on that review show that came out a few weeks when Paul and I discussed the 2017 Best American Comics volume. And I would guess that this has been the case for the past several years, especially. If we just limit, or if you just limit the number of comics that are available in print, I think that is gigantic, right? I mean, how do you sift through all that? You add both web comics and digital comics into the into the mix. And I would think that the process would be almost debilitating. I know that we do a monthly webcomics series on the Comics Alternative, and I have to tell you, there's just so much material out there. It's almost impossible for us to sift through everything, because when it comes to webcomics, there is not that big of a barrier to entry for creators. Almost anyone who has access to the internet in some form or another can publish a webcomic, even a very rudimentary one that could be very good, but still very simple and basic. And so because of that, there are so many people who publish webcomics. So I say this to ask both of you, in coming up with this year's volume, or the 2017 volume, and Bill, with you over the past several years, I mean, do you think that the proliferation of online comics has gotten to the point that you feel almost helpless in trying to keep up with things?
It's certainly not possible to literally see everything in comics on a year-to-year basis. And all we can do is do our best and follow, our interests, because ultimately we're going to be the ones making the choices. But I do spend quite a bit of time online, and it's not just webcomics. It seems that every time a platform pops up, someone puts a comic there. A couple of artists over the last year or so have been putting comics on Instagram. Now that Instagram has this feature where you can swipe through an album and see multiple images there. Michael DeForge has been doing a comic strip there called Leaving Richards Valley. Matthew Thurber has been doing his Mr. Colostomy strips on Instagram, and I've seen some others. So obviously, it's an uphill battle to try and see everything. But at the same time, I think, as you say, even just limiting it to print would already be a daunting task. But I am kind of glad that we have that open purview, because it does allow us to find little bits and pieces from all over the place that, when you put them together in an anthology, present a nice series of possibilities and propositions. I mean, like Ben was saying before, that piece by Sienna Cittadino, that was a nice addition to the anthology, but that's something that, as far as I know, only existed on Tumblr. So to have that in the book next to work that was published in print by large publishers and things that were photocopied or risographed or whatever, I think allows us to put together a book that at least suggests the parameters of the comics form as it exists today on a year-by-year basis.
Ben, do you keep up with online comics as Bill does?
I mean, I see them. They're usually cross-posted somewhere. That's how I stumble on them, on Facebook or Twitter. But, to go... I mean, I look at the two European sites I look at. So we're just talking about North American comics, but, I regularly check these big European online sites. So, I mean, it's a full-time job for somebody working as a librarian, I guess, to look at all this stuff and sort through it. I looked at as much as I could for that year, much more than I would normally look at. So it's not it's beyond my normal comics reading. It just, I wouldn't have time to do anything else. And I like to keep up with it, with what's happening. But, it goes beyond North America, because a lot of great comics are happening all over the world. Mm-hmm. So just multiply the numbers for North America by countries where there are state subsidies for publishing, for small press. So there's even more published in France and Belgium. And there's a lot of work to look at. And so that's how it was. I mean, the deadline came. I would have kept looking. I mean, there's no reason to stop looking except there was a publication deadline. You could look for the rest of your life within that time, that year, and maybe you'd eventually say, I've seen most of what happened, but we ran out of time.
Yeah. Well, Ben, I know you do work on with the New York Comics and Picture Stories Symposium, and so that exposes you to quite a number of comics texts beyond these shores, right? But I know that with the Houghton Mifflin Harcourt series, you're kind of limited in terms of geography.
Right. And, I guess people could, do you have to, I forget if you have to work in English to be in this book.
It's a little vague. I would actually have to check the stipulations in the contract.
Yeah, but that's a limitation. I mean, it's hard enough. I mean, I think we looked at some Mexican work that I couldn't read. I could just look at, and the thing is, it does make you. I mean, I'm the most jaded reader of comics. I've been reading alternative comics, since I was a teenager, and so my criteria was just, does this thing excite me again about comics? And then I would say, yeah, that should probably be a contender for this kind of a book. But getting the stuff in front of your eyes. It's not like reading a manuscript. If these were prose manuscripts, it would be impossibly complicated because you'd have to read them. Comic strip, part of it is visual and it's instantaneous. And you can get a sense of how somebody's using at least the visual end of it without having to go through a manuscript and read the whole thing. So it's a little easier for me, I think, in that way.
Now, in addition to this being one of the most, as I said earlier, provocative and challenging and expansive, I guess, volumes of Best American Comics that I can remember, there are two other things that really mark the 2017 volume, and I think that comes out very clearly in both your forward, Bill, and then, Ben, in your introduction, and that is the book's, I guess, relatively speaking, political tone, which is not strong, but at least there's more of a presence there of the current political moment, but also the humor. Now, Bill, this is one of the things I really appreciated about your foreword in this year's volume. You did point out where we are at the time politically and how this particular time couldn't have helped but seep in to the volume in some way.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was kind of, in a way, it was a response to the work that artists made and a response to, in particular, the cover by Matthew Thurber too. I mean, I wouldn't presume to be prescriptive otherwise and tell artists what they need to do or how to respond to any particular moment. But frankly, I actually don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of all artists to, overtly respond to, political events. I think their work will naturally take them in that direction. Others, just by making the work that they make, I think in a more implicit way are modeling a type of freedom that we should strive for in all aspects of our social and political life. There's I think there's an implicit politics just to being an independent, creative person. But nevertheless, having said all that, like I said, I was I think I was responding to how the volume came together, and I think you can go through the book and you can see, there's some work that is what it is and isn't necessarily responding to a particular moment. There's some work that's overtly political. L.E. Valley, of course, is the most obvious example there. But I mean, certainly Sam Alden's piece, Test of Loyalty, is about surveillance and immigration and just projecting about 15 minutes into the future and imagining where something like that can go, and a couple of the other pieces similarly touched on relevant topics. Joe Sacco's piece was actually an overt piece of campaign literature that was produced for a city council candidate, but rather than just in a very direct way endorsing the candidate, it depicted the candidate interviewing a lot of people about the problems with gentrification and rent in Portland, Oregon. So anyway, as I said, I think it's inevitable that some artists' work will take them in that direction. Others, will continue along the path that they're already following. Anyway, it just seemed necessary to make a note of that. I think in part because of the cover, in part because of the work that was in the book, and just in part because I'm a feeling, thinking person who, worked on this comics anthology at the same time, like everyone else. I was obsessively listening to the news and reading news analyses and trying to get a handle on our current political situation.
Yeah, the two that you mention as overtly political, Valley Schlong and Joe Sacco's Rent Crisis, are two that I had in mind where the politics is definitely apparent. I'm curious about Rent Crisis. It struck me, I didn't know about that comic, that brochure, I guess, before I picked up this volume of Best American Comics. And it seems to me that has a particularly, I guess, local intent. And so I'm curious how either of you discovered Rent Crisis.
I remember. How did we discover that? I don't remember.
Well, that was distributed as a print item, as a print object in Portland, where obviously it was, intended to be seen. But it had been posted as a PDF on the candidate's campaign website. And I think I just saw somehow, I saw it being linked to online, either through a comics news website like the Comics Reporter or through social media. So that's just the kind of thing that I would have seen online, immediately downloaded as a PDF and put in with the
That's where
digital material I was keeping track of during my period of seeking and looking.
Now, Bill, you've mentioned a couple of times the cover of the 2017 volume, and for our listeners who may need a little refresher, the cover alludes to Orwell's 1984. And in fact, someone picking up the 2017 Best American Comics volume may think that this is one that came out quite a number of years ago. I'm wondering, what kind of reaction have you guys gotten about this cover, about Thurber's cover?
I can say that among artists, people have really appreciated it. It is a kind of open, I think it was a little maybe risky for the publisher to take on, because, these books do, all of these titles, Best American Comics, Best American Essays, whatever, they really signal their timeliness as a virtue. And even though we do have the current year on the cover as well, I can see someone potentially getting a little confused in the bookstore and not immediately grasping, at a quick glance what the book is. Where was I going? Oh, in terms of reaction, I know that artists have reacted well to it. I think artists who I've spoken to have really appreciated how, bold and risky it is, the extent to which Matthew was really not shy about putting his response to the current political situation front and center. And also, I think one of the things that artists have appreciated actually is that, even though one of the things that in some ways the cover it's almost more a piece of design than a drawing in some ways, because the bulk of the space is taken up by an evocation of a pre-existing graphic design, that well-known North American paperback cover for 1984. But Matthew really packs a lot of narrative into it, too. I mean, you have this this figure who's barely seen, who's like, knee deep in rising coastal waters that are swarming with dying fish, and in the background there's an oil rig, and there's a drone delivering a package that has a little smiley face on it that somewhat resembles the Amazon logo, and this kind of dystopian image of like unabated environmental catastrophe, and people being sort of distracted by technology that is entertaining them, but at the same time is also accelerating these dystopian possibilities. So that's a lot to pack into the margins of a cover, when about 75% of it is taken up with this evocation of the 1984 paperback. So I think people appreciate all those things.
Now, another feel, I guess, in terms of the politics of the 2017 volume comes obviously from your introduction, or maybe I should say your introductions, plural, Ben. I think your introduction to the volume that you guest edited is unique on a number of levels. Its humor, I think, is definitely a big marker, but also this is an introduction that is in pieces. I mean, you could read the various segments almost separately. I mean, obviously they all go together. And for those who haven't looked at the 2017 volume of Best American Comics, well, first off, shame on you. You should have picked it up by now. But your intro, Ben, you start off with what looks like, I guess, an official letter from the U.S. Chamber of Comics, which is a nonprofit membership organization representing the unified interest of the U.S. cartoonists before Congress, government agencies, and other courts. And then there is a pamphlet-like piece. And then after that, you get a series of, I would assume, faux, but maybe you can tell me otherwise, emails between you, Ben, and Bill about what to include in the 2017 volume. And then there's a faux newspaper piece where, Ben, you're arrested. Was your intent to be political in this introduction there even before you decided exactly what to include in the 2017 volume?
No, I just wanted to cover all of my feelings about editing a book like that. Mm-hmm. And that goes from, who is celebrating comics, what that is about, what does it mean to celebrate the best American comics, and, this kind of nationalistic label to a book. And then my complete, analysis of the field of comics and what people are doing in it, maybe is seen as forms of mental illness. And then my guilt at doing this thing, and why I did it, and that I explaining that we ran out of time. So yeah, I tried to cover all those feelings, and I thought it was the idea was to make it an entertaining way to say all that, and not just say it like I just did. So yeah, that was my idea. And there are all kinds of text, image objects, letterheads, official or whatever, a press release. Mm-hmm. This kind of boring brochure from a mental health, I think it's the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Cartoonists, and a newspaper, a tabloid newspaper, and add those things together. But yeah, so that's it. It covered my guilt and my pleasure and my kind of analysis of why people are making these things. Well, at least trying to understand that.
So how much money did you make off those penitentiary inmates?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think the bribes were from the inmates. I think it was implied they might have been from the contributors to the book. But it could be other things, not just, I mean, yeah, it is a tremendous, any way you slice it, it becomes this favor you've done to somebody. But that's the way the world works. People do things for people. Either they want to be paid back or they do it just as a pure philanthropic gesture. So I don't expect anything from this. I mean, few of the contributors have gotten in touch with me and, thanking me for salvaging their career or making their career or helping them. But I don't expect any kickbacks or bribes or anything.
Something you said a moment ago, Ben, related to kind of making a comment on what it means to have something called Best Of. That's something else that I got from not only your introduction, but I think the volume as a whole. One of the things that impressed me was you taking on this very concept of a best of collection in some form or another. Every year around December, sometimes earlier, we get a list of the best of, and not only in terms of comics, but other popular forms of entertainment. And although that's understandable, I see why people do it. In many ways, it's a problematic and even troublesome exercise. And I know when I listen to or read about other people's best of lists, let's say in comics for a particular year, I don't know, more times than not, I end up getting a little irritated because it's limiting in one form or another. So I found it refreshing that not only in the intro, but in the selections that you made, you seem to be taking on this very idea of creating a best of and having fun with that project, while at the same time engaging in it yourself.
Yeah. I mean, why would I impose my taste on reading public? I mean, it could be a private list for myself, and I wouldn't even sort of try to standardize it into a list. I just see things I like, and I'm happy I discover them. But it needed some explanation or apology, but that's all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the position of a book like this relative to the proliferation of best of lists that have sort of increasingly popped up at the end of every year. I mean, that's certainly a great thing that's resulted from the democratizing power of the internet, that, we have all of these critical voices that pop up online. I think one of the differences is that, certainly what we do is we don't just make a list, but we sort of put that work together to speak as a kind of argument, and we put it out into the public sphere as a book, so that readers can engage with that material. I think, when you're reading a best of list online, unless it's coming from a critic whose criticism you value and have engaged with over time, I think it can become just a sort of practice of comparative list making, where you look at someone's list and you say, oh, they like that. Well, I hated that. Or, well, they didn't include my fave. And, it just becomes, you're just doing a kind of compare and contrast with your own sense of what the best of the past year was. And in this case, we're not bringing in critics exactly, but we're bringing in artists usually, people like Ben or Roz Chast or others, and sort of, putting them in the position of a critic, and I think trying to give them a kind of, as best we can, a sort of privileged access to a broad sweep of work that they might not have encountered in their day-to-day reading. So on the one hand, I think what we do is we are very upfront about the fact that these books are subjective. We put the guest editor's name on every volume. It's a different person every year. Hopefully each year the volume has a different sensibility as a result, and I think it does. And so we're pretty upfront about the fact that this is a subjective selection of material. On the other hand, we pick people whose tastes are going to be interesting. I think because many of them are artists, we don't necessarily see them performing in that role of a critic often, at least not explicitly. So it's interesting to see how they would view a year's worth of contemporary comics. Again, I think because of the process, at the very least, we can also say that we cover a lot of ground to get to the point of having those final selections.
Yeah, this is the closest I would ever get. The closest I would ever get to writing comics criticism, which I wouldn't do. I don't have to. I don't. Yeah, that's a whole life's work to do that seriously. So I don't do that. But I think my introduction tried to touch on like what's not in the book and why is it not in the book, rather than talking about why I chose the things that are in the book. So that's the closest I think I'll get to comics criticism. I think it's a valuable field, but who's going to do it? Who has the time or money? I mean, I guess an academic should do it. Somebody who makes a living doing something else could spend time doing serious criticism. But you'd have to, as I said, it's a full-time job.
I remember one of the things that both Paul and I said in our review of Best American Comics 2017 is that, both of us look forward to every year's Best American Comics for at least a couple of reasons. One, to some degree, it kind of strokes our ego in that many of the titles and the creators that over the past years have been included in these volumes are texts and people that we appreciate, that we've even talked about on the podcast. And so it's almost like patting ourselves on the back. I see we have good taste. On the other hand, there are a lot of creators that are included in every year's volume that we didn't know about before. So it's a great way of discovering new talent. I have to say that with the 2017 volume, when I first opened it, I mean, there were some names that I immediately recognized, right? I mean, there's Bill Griffith, Gary Panter, Tim Lane, Kim Deitch, Gabrielle Bell. But the majority of the people included in the 2017 volume were from creators I hadn't even heard of before. And I remember feeling, okay, this is going to be a bigger challenge than I initially expected in terms of reading this book from cover to cover, just because I wasn't familiar with them. There have been other volumes that I've picked up, and it's, the majority of the work I'm familiar with in one form or another, or at least something that the creators have done. This one was very different. And again, that's part of what I meant earlier when I said that this has to be one of the most challenging texts, and challenging on multiple levels, but I just didn't know the creators, and that's something I was excited about when I saw the 2017 volume.
Yeah, I was trying to find things I had never seen before. I mean, it would have been a really boring book if it were just my friends and the comics people I like and whose work I've liked. And I mean, that would not have been too exciting for me. But there's a cartoonist in Sami Alwani.
Yes.
Who he's based up in Toronto. He told me that he, this is recently, not before I didn't know who he was. I knew nothing about him. But he told me he discovered alternative comics through an early issue of Best American Comics when he was a teenager. And he remembers said he was trying to copy a strip of mine, the drawing of something of mine that was in that issue. And so for him, it opened up a whole world of comics, and I was in it. So it's a strange turn of events, but these things happen.
It's interesting that you say that, because if you think about it, to okay, I was about to say the general reading public, but even that's very sketchy. But I think to people who are maybe introduced to or who know about comics but don't really delve very deeply into the medium, they primarily know of comics by, let's say, mainstream publishers, DC, Marvel, those type of comics. And it's not as if they have ready availability to certain texts or avenues that would introduce them to alternative comics or indie creators or mini comics, whatever you want to call them. But that's one of the functions, I think, that Best American Comics serves, is that it is a way for readers who may be browsing in a Barnes & Noble or their local bookstore to find out about the kind of comics that most people who think they know about comics, because, you know, they go to Marvel and DC Films after all, right? They have a subscription to Netflix. So when they think of comics, they don't think of the things that are really out there that kind of challenge our understanding of the typical superhero fare as comics. This is there for them.
Well, I don't entirely embrace your premise, because I think there are so many different kinds of audiences for comics and so many levels of awareness that it's kind of hard to understand sometimes, even, you know, what the kind of, you know, broadly speaking, quote unquote, general audience is. There's definitely an enormous mass audience that's aware of Marvel and DC because of, as you say, film and television, you know, and everyone is at least kind of vaguely conscious of the fact that these characters originate in comic books, and many people maybe saw them growing up. But I think anyone looking in a graphic novel section at a Barnes & Noble, if they have a kind of light exposure to comics, is maybe more likely to be instead the kind of reader who doesn't really know the extent of the comic scene, but has maybe seen works like Unhome or Persepolis or Mouse or something like that. So, I mean, those are two different kinds of general audiences. They're both sort of mass compared to, like, the niche comic specialist. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunities for discovery with something like a Best American Comics volume. I do think that that's one of the values of the series, that it's a kind of doorway into the field, because you can see a lot of different approaches every year collected into one book. And I think for even, you know, a general reader, there's certainly a lot of opportunity for discovery. But I think because we're so open to all kinds of work, and because we, you know, we really try and seek out the most interesting work every year, and even seek out work that's from a little bit outside of what we might think of as the constructed field of comics sometimes. There's even an opportunity for discovery for people who know the field very well and keep up with even alternative comics. Because, you know, you can certainly spend a lot of time just keeping up with the work published by publishers, including Fantagraphics, Orna Quarterly, Koyama Press, et cetera, but there's still, even then, a bigger world of, you know, very, very small micro publishers, you know, sometimes printing risograph editions, and self-publishing artists, and people putting stuff up online, and then people who, you know, just kind of pop up out of nowhere and send in work that is really interesting. I think that I had never, as far as I know, seen work by Sami Alwani, who Ben was just talking about, until his comic, The Dead Father, appeared in the mail as a submission. And that's me speaking as someone who's looking for work and going to very independent comics festivals, small press comics festivals, etc. You know, and I also had a chance to speak with Sami, and he really is. I think he graduated from school a couple years ago, and that was something that he started writing or working on when he was in school. And it's basically his first complete self-published comic. So even for someone who follows the field very closely, something like that is a discovery. Whereas, for a very general reader, maybe they never checked out the work of Michael DeForge before, even though he's well known within the independent comics world. And for a very general reader who just browses graphic novels at the bookstore, that might be the first time they actually pay attention to a story by Michael DeForge, just as an example.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, when I said earlier something about like a general readership, that's one of the reasons why I problematized that term. I mean, I know that there are different audiences and different readerships. I was talking about the kind of really, really small press, micro even, that is included not only in the volume that Ben edited, but in previous ones as well. In other words, kind of deep dives, as you were describing with Alwari, things that even people who deal in comics on a day-to-day basis may not know about. I mean, those things are not as apparent to most readers of whatever audience you're talking about, and to a large degree, I think even people like Satrapi, Spiegelman, they have been mainstreamed to where it's not difficult to see their books when you go to bookstores, right? But many of these creators whose work you would never see before, the only way that I think most potential readers would find their work is through the Best American Comics volume, which I think is a great service.
Yeah,
oh, thanks.
I mean, they could go online and look around, and there are a few big aggregators of zines and things. I can't remember their names off. I mean, it's not hard to find this work online if you look for it. You might miss something. But I also wanted to look at other places where comics were being made, like prisons and therapeutic workshops. And that's a whole realm of work that sometimes doesn't get into print, or it's seen on the wall in a workshop, and or it's not seen at all. It's done just for a small group of people, like classroom work. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff done in my classes at Parsons that's sort of amazing. And it's, it has the freshness of somebody who's never made a comic before, and how they try to deal with the form. So I tried to include a few of those things in the book.
Well, let me ask this. Bill, you as series editor, and then Ben, you as the guest editor to the latest volume. How painful is it at times to cut material that you would like to include, but due to space restraints, you just can't include it? Or even other kind of restraints, like, for instance, not being able to get permission to reprint?
Well, there's a list Bill puts together at the back of notable work that he, it's his, list. And so I think most of the stuff I found that we could get, it got into the book. I don't think. I was thinking about trying to get some of Steve Ditko's new work, and I think you mentioned it wasn't easy to get the rights to that, but reprint rights. But other than that, I can't think of anything that we couldn't include. So,
well, there's always a moment towards the end of the process where the guest editor has assembled kind of a list, and then but there's so many constraints involved in this project, and one of them is page count, and at a certain point we just have to sit down and look at what they want to include and figure out how that works or doesn't work or could work with the page count that's available to us. Sometimes that has something to do also with for work that's being excerpted, deciding how long or short that excerpt might be. In some cases, a guest editor might want to include initially a longer excerpt from a book, and then realizing it's actually taking up a lot of space in the book that's forestalling the possibility of maybe having a little bit more as much variety as they would like to have. So there's a certain kind of almost like an internal negotiation that the guest editors often has to go through at the end of the process of figuring out, like, what can I live with? What pieces can't I live without? And sometimes getting to a point of really having to make some tough choices. But I think I don't remember very specifically when Ben and I were working on that part of the process. He may have already gotten it down pretty close to the page count at that point. So there may not have been as much agonizing at that final stage as there has been sometimes.
Yeah, and it's just, this will send people to work. If this is, there's just some publisher told me they get a negative bump in sales if something appears in this book, because that's all that the readers want to see. They don't go back or they don't go on and buy work by these artists. So
that's a very old. I just want to say, in the book's defense, that's a very old anecdote now from a very pessimistic publisher.
Yeah, I don't know if it's true, but it could be, because there's only so much time you have to devote to any field. Like, if I read the best American short stories, I would say, well, that's enough. It'd be a pretty rare writer who I'd sort of search out and say, I need to know more about them. So I don't know. It depends on how much free time you have and how deep your interest is. But I think one thing that was on our mind was how to make it a good self-contained anthology. So there were enough long stories and enough things that worked, a short thing. Just like you'd edit any anthology. So that's... and I like short comics, so that's no problem. The short things were no problem for me. I think you can get an idea of somebody's sensibility pretty quickly in one page.
Yeah. Well, Bill alluded earlier to the differences in perspective and sensibility of different guest editors. And I know that one of the things that some guest editors have done in the past is to group their selections according to certain criteria, whether that be genre-based or theme or topic or what have you. Ben, you don't have any sections in the 2017 volume, and I'm wondering, was that kind of division something that you considered, or maybe something you never even thought of when you sat down to collect what you wanted to include in the volume?
No, I wasn't thinking of, what categories these. And I think it's more exciting to push these things up against unlike work, rather than to say, well, here are all the 1970s people who were still working. Here are all the... I think, it's just, it was more sequencing that I was thinking about than categorizing the work. What should come first? I think we put a lot of thought into the layout of the book. What should come first and how the thing should end. That it should end on Bill Griffith, being involved in putting together the best American gag cartoons book as a kid, and it should start with what did it start with? Gary
Panther.
Yeah, his view of the future of art. So, and everything in between, like where it went from there. It's completely organic decision about what looked good next to another strip, and what broke up the monotony of reading the thing as an anthology. But no categories. I've seen those. They're not too helpful for me to think about. I sort of dealt with the categories in my introduction. These mental health.
The brochure suggests some of them.
So to go into sort of break it down by that, there'd be like one category with nothing in it. So that's how we were working.
And it was rather nice, actually. This was another opportunity that we had just because Ben and I are both in New York. Every year after the guest editor makes their selections, we send the actual printed works that have been chosen, where there is a printed work, to the publisher, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And in the design department, they go through and they photocopy, the exact pages of all the selections, and they start to make like a dummy book that they use for proofreading and pagination and things like that. And they actually, I think it was at Ben's request, sent us a copy of that photocopied pile of paper that represented Ben's selections, and we spent an afternoon in Ben's office where he moved all of the stories around until it achieved a sequence that felt right to him, just laying them out next to each other on the floor.
And Ben, you mentioned that in arranging the selections in this volume, how did you put it? How they look next to each other? Are you talking about visually as well?
To keep the reader awake, to have some kind of a shocking juxtaposition of things. It's entertainment, and you want to keep a reader going through 300 plus pages. There has to be, a hot and cold shower going on in their mind, and they look at this stuff and they think they're back in 1960s underground comics, and the next minute they're in some other world. And I think something productive could come out of that, disorienting the reader in a way.
Well, I think Ben, you did a very good job at disorienting the reader with this most recent volume, but disorienting in my book in a very good way.
Oh, yeah. Well, nobody's getting hurt by this disorient. It's just aesthetic, or disorienting your taste, or making you question your taste, which is what I'm doing. If somebody asked you to pick your favorite work from a year, you do start questioning your own taste, and so it's disorienting for me too to look at all this work.
You were going to say, Bill?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say just following up on what Ben just said. I think especially anyone who puts themselves in the position of being any kind of critic or scholar, especially, has a real responsibility, and I think artists do it all the time too, has a kind of responsibility to constantly be questioning their own taste, because I do think, and I certainly, I felt this myself in my life, and also working on Best American Comics in particular, I think you have to be aware that there's a danger that you'll get to a point where you've arrived at a certain critical point of view, a certain type of taste or sensibility, but that it could become reflexive. It could just harden into a kind of personal dogma. And that's fine if you're, putting toppings on a pizza or something like that. But, art is different. Artists, in some ways, it's the job of the artist to give you something that you didn't know was important, that you didn't imagine could exist, to do things in a way that you had imagined they could have been done before. It's kind of the job of art and artists to surprise you and to make you question your assumptions. So I know for me that's part of my process. Even when I'm looking at work, as I'm going through things, I really, even though I know that I have my tastes and my critical positions and so forth, even when I'm reviewing work that's coming in, I'm trying on some level to always think about, what is it that this work is trying to be, and is it doing that well? And then, of course, the next question is, well, and if it is, how does that sit in a kind of position relative to all the other stuff that's out there, and that's a different question. But anyway, and I can only hope certainly that the general reader who might pick up one of these volumes will accept the challenge of being challenged by the volume instead of just having their perspective confirmed.
And what you just said reminds me of something that you wrote in the foreword to this volume that I found very compelling. And I think I mentioned this on the review episode where Paul and I discussed Great American Comics 2017. You're talking about
Best American, greatest. You're going.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay,
great.
Yeah,
Other than
Best American. Okay, Best American.
And I'm all going to be.
I slipped into a Frank Norris reference. I guess.
In history, of the great. They're just the best for that year. Whether they're great, I don't.
Yeah. So in this current volume of Best American Comics, you say in the foreword, Bill, I guess you're talking about artists who push the boundaries in a variety of different ways and making the case that this is actually necessary given today's marketplace. You say precisely because those odds are so daunting, artists entering the field should engage the medium and take risks, expressive risk and artistic risks. In a field with no guarantees, compromising one's work to meet a perceived marketplace is a much riskier gamble than wholehearted, incautious engagement. Personal creative ambition is a safer bet on its own terms than a career plan. And to me, I mean, not only is that sensible advice, but it also, I think, underscores the necessity for these Best American comic volumes, right? Because someone's going to pick this up, let's say an uninformed reader, and they get this book, Best American Comics. And with whatever understanding they have of comics, they're going to flip through this and they're going to say, well, I don't understand some of this stuff. This is best. Where's the stuff that I'm familiar with? But in your foreword, you're addressing this head on. You're saying that, well, these are boundary expanding and challenging examples of the kind of comics that are being created today. And because they are challenging, in many ways, they are more ambitious and even successful than, let's say, work that feeds into a particular market's taste.
Well, I mean, in some ways, this connects sort of inadvertently to Ben's introduction as well. This idea of, I mean, the way Ben put it, like, I'm a cartoonist, not a mental health problem. But just this idea that, I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes, every year I have to, I write a foreword. And, I have to think a little bit about, what do I want to say this year? In some ways, it's connected to what's in the book. And in some ways, it's also connected to just sort of what I see happening around me in terms of the comics field or the conversation around the comics field. I think, there is a kind of, one of the things that I see in the world of comics today, that's a little different from when I was younger, is a kind of push towards certain types of professionalization, which is not a bad thing if it means that there's more chances for people to make a living, but people are looking at things like, imprints that have been started by major publishing houses, or the possibilities of, super successful Kickstarter campaigns or whatever, and there are some people who are kind of just entering the field, I think, or recently entered the field, and, they're kind of looking at those possibilities and trying to figure out how they can fit into it. And, that's understandable, but it's also the type of thing that I think for anyone who is interested in art, you can see how it might be concerning if there's a sense that the consideration of those possibilities might potentially be affecting the kind of art that one might make. And the truth of the matter is, as I articulate in the introduction, is that there's just no guarantees, no matter what you might try to do to manage possibilities. It's one of the things that I remember a lot, that I think of a lot, is something that Charles Burns said once. I don't remember if it was in a on-stage conversation or a talk or an interview or something, or if it was in private or what. But I remember him saying this thing once where he was remembering being in school. And, at that moment, the idea of being a professional alternative comics artist didn't exist. Underground comics were, pretty much over. This was before, Raw and Love and Rocket started. I'm sure Ben remembers this time period as well, this kind of sort of very sterile period in terms of possibilities for what one might do in comics. But he was talking about being in art school and trying out a lot of different things and talking to a professor there and saying, like, I don't know, what am I doing? What should I do? Should I go for the fine art thing that I'm kind of interested in? Should I, pursue more of like an illustration type of career? Should I, explore these comics that I'm interested in? It's, what's the smart thing to do here? And the professor told him, listen, no matter what you do, it's going to be hard. So, the advice is like, do the thing that you really want to do, because, you can try and take a safe path. But if you're talking about making an independent career in any creative field, it's going to be really hard. And there are no guarantees. It's like, even if you want to sell out, it's hard to sell out, and, there are a lot of failed sellouts out there. So, there's, just the fact that we have this kind of thin infrastructure where, there are graphic novel sections in libraries and bookstores, and, you see, comics reviewed regularly in Publishers Weekly and so on. I think there's a pretty big gap between the small percentage of blockbuster books that support artists who are actually able to more or less make a full-time living, and the much greater mass of people who really function much the same way as most literary authors, which is that, they get a little advance and they get some royalties, but it's not enough to live on, and they still have to teach, or depend on a spouse, or, something else entirely. So it's not a panacea, there's no golden road. So given all of that, given comics history, given that the vast majority of the comics field is still, very independent, very low, poorly compensated work. I mean, if you're going to do it, if you're going to engage the form, engage the form instead of trying to come up with some facsimile of what comics can be that you think there might be a buying audience for.
Now, Best American Comics 2017 has been out for about, 5 months, a little longer. What kind of reaction have either of you received from, not reviewers, but let's say individual readers, through any kind of correspondence or word of mouth about this volume and how it may be different from previous ones?
No, most of my response has been through the few reviews it's gotten, and just heard from one or two of the contributors, but that's it. I mean, I think in this vast kind of field now, it's kind of this drop in the bucket of what's happening in anthologies and all. So I don't get. I didn't hear from too many readers about it. Just that people were curious to sometimes see what I would put into such a book, but nothing that I can. Trying to think of any. Nothing. Mainly review. It got some very good reviews, but people, but I think maybe if there were a more serious critical press about comics, this kind of a book would take its place in a bigger critical discussion. And so you'd say, well, there are all these people writing about all of these things and trying to form people's taste about comics and where that should go. So I guess I don't. There's some, I guess, there's some, but maybe not enough. And then this wouldn't be, maybe we could just call it my favorite American comics rather than the best. And it would be more like a very subjective thing. And so maybe that's what they should do.
I think that's what it is in essence. But it's part of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's best series.
Right.
So
right. I think it wouldn't sell if you said, these are my favorite. You may not like them, American comics. So probably wouldn't sell as well. But I don't know. I'm trying to think if I heard from readers. I don't know. I don't know. I think these things get spread through the world of social media now. People make their comments and you just read them somewhere online rather than them writing directly to me or calling me up.
Well, also it may have something to do with the point that you made, I think in some way just a moment ago, Ben, and that is the place of anthologies in comics culture or in terms of comics reading. I don't know, and I don't have any data to back this up. I haven't done the research, but it just seems to me that anthologies are less prominent, or at least I'm seeing fewer of them now than I was years in the past. And I know I've mentioned this on a couple of podcast episodes, and one example that I refer to is that we don't have a Dark Horse Presents anymore, right? That's a more mainstream example, but I think even when it comes to more indie kind of anthologies, there just aren't as many as there used to be, and maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe it's just a matter of what I'm exposed to and the limitations of them. But and along with that, I just wonder if the same kind of seriousness when it comes to comics criticism and even comic scholarship is given to anthologies like it is to, the graphic novel with a capital G and N.
Right.
Well, I think... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I mean, most anthologies are just some editor's taste. They're not trying to always look at everything that's out there and pick things. They commission work and they go after certain work. So, that's a different kind of project than finding existing work that might have been overlooked. So it is different. But I think Fantagraphics has a new anthology, right? Book they put out in
now, and in fact,
Portal has one.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, in fact, we've discussed at different times the first two issues of Now, and I think it's on those episodes that I've made a similar observation that there doesn't seem to be as many anthologies, and they can go a long way toward really making not only individual creators but also defining a particular reader's taste in comics. And in some ways, whether I should or not, I compare the new Now from Fantagraphics from their previous anthology, Mome, and I know that they've had others as well, but Mome to me was a high point in what they were doing in terms of anthologies. And I absolutely love that series. I was sorry to see it go. And that's one of the reasons why I was excited last year when they announced a new anthology that they were titling Now.
Well, maybe for most people, flipping through Tumblr or Instagram is their anthology. They just see there's so much work.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think there's kind of it's too easy to see a lot of work in a way. So if you want to see it, I mean, I could spend all day looking at new comics online and finding things I've never seen. I mean, with absolute ease. I just know exactly, where to go. And printing is expensive. Selling books is complicated. These are not put out by publishing companies that have a large subsidy behind them. And so maybe that's why the logic behind it is not there to put out more anthologies. But, I think for the people who want to expose themselves to this work, it's just more available than ever. Same with the history, the whole history of comics. Things that, would take 10 years to discover. When I was a child, you can find in a few minutes online now. So I think the crisis for a cartoonist today is who's going to subsidize this work? If it can't be, it can't follow the model of the fine art world where you sell a comic strip for $1 million and you live on that for a few years. If it's going to follow the model of the old publishing world, that needs a subsidy. And, it can't be Google should be subsidizing all of this since they've taken away the sale of maps and cookbooks and all these other utilitarian things that used to subsidize literary publishing.
Yeah.
So, that's the obvious solution. They should be required. And, I think it's coming around to that. People are saying, why are we building this incredible advertising machine for Facebook? And no one's being paid to do this, and they're making money. And it's becoming pretty obvious to people. This is not a good deal. Or it should be run in a little more useful way for the people who fill the inches of these endless scrolls with material. So, I don't know that a print anthology would help. Somebody would probably lose some money putting it out, and they wouldn't have money to pay the contributors very well. They never did. And so, I don't know. It's kind of a strange thing to think about doing. I don't know how Houghton Mifflin, they do all kinds of other things, right? Textbooks and things. So maybe they make, I don't know what subsidizes this exactly, but that was something that would need to look into their finances. But anyway, yeah. So that's sort of the crisis. It's an accepted form by the academy. You can tell your parents you're going to school to study graphic novels, but simultaneously, the corporate publishing world that used to subsidize some of this stuff is in trouble. So, people are figuring these things out, but it's, more like individual patrons and figuring out how that. And there's almost no room for the middleman of an editor or the middleman of a publisher. It seems like that's a luxury now, to say, I'm going to bring you to the world. Like, you need them to do that. If they can't pay, if they can't subsidize the act of doing that, who exactly needs that? If the book doesn't sell, it's kind of it's just like a double failure. You put your work out there. You haven't made any money. They haven't made any money. You can't go on doing it. I think, these issues of subsidy and how this stuff always worked, how literary publishing always worked, ought to be reinvented. Advertising is one way, and subsidies, non-profit or philanthropic subsidy is another way to do it. The guy who founded eBay subsidizes, this great investigative journalism website, and he actually pays people, The Intercept, and they also do the Nib. And that's the model. That seems to be a really fair, logical model. Every material thing in the world that does make money, like computer screens or headphones or whatever people make, some part of that profit should go to the immaterial world of things that are hard to sell because you can look at them for free, or they have no physical substance. Once they're online or somebody digitizes them. So, that war in Switzerland, there's a big supermarket that puts like 2% of their annual earnings to the arts, and it's millions of Swiss francs. It's a lot of money. So it's not a big deal for them. 2% of what Google makes every year would fund probably a lot of good cartoonists. So maybe that's. The thing is how to get. This has to be done voluntarily, since we don't have somebody telling people what they have to do. But so some people may come around to that.
Yeah. Well, Ben, you've thrown down the gauntlet to the corporate world now.
Yeah. They do it. There's that big lecture series the Molson does up in Canada. Companies do it. And I just think if more of them did it on a large scale, it could help fund a lot of this work. And that's depends how much money you need to live, of course, where you live and how much money you need to live. But it's there seems to be no shortage of people making work worth looking at, and I guess there's an audience, maybe not big enough, so it has to be subsidized. Yeah. There was a big picket line at Angoulême this year. Macron made, in all these rewriting of the French labor law, somehow they snuck in a thing that books that you sell at comics festivals don't count toward your royalties. And that's where they sell most of their books. And it was this incredibly cruel idea to say those books don't count. If you sign 100 books at Angoulême, that's not those are considered like promotional books, giveaways or something.
That's incredible too, because the artists in France. Ben, because you go to France pretty regularly. Even more so than in the U.S., the artists in France are expected to actually spend a lot of time making a really nice drawing and signature in each book.
The smaller publishers are not following this.
Right, the dédicace tradition.
Yeah, but the bigger publishers are. And so I don't know. It's why, if writing and art and making comics of a certain kind has always been a precarious way to make a living, that's nothing new. But I think there were other things to fall back on. So you could teach. So that's become a precarious way for most people to make a living. Or you could drive a taxi. And that's become a precarious. They can't be everything. Can't be precarious, because otherwise, you'll end up with everybody committing suicide in front of City Hall. Can't be. There used to be these fallbacks where you could make a decent living. So I think, I guess, in that way, cartoonists are not in any different situation than, adjunct teachers or people driving for Uber or all these other companies. It's in the same boat, basically.
Well, Bill, I know that you're in the midst of pulling together this, or making, I guess, final preparations for this year's, the 2018 volume of Best American Comics. Is there, and I know that there are things that you can't say about it, but is there anything you can say about the 2018 Best American Comics volume?
I can actually tell you one thing about it, because usually the couple of times we've spoken in the past, it's been pretty close to the release date of the, Best American Comics volume we're discussing. Now it's been a few months, and in the interim, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt has actually released their list announcing guest editors for all of their 2018 Best American volumes. So I can tell you, if you haven't seen that list already, that the Best American Comics 2018 will be guest edited by Phoebe Gleckner. And given, of course, how the process works and the kind of necessary time lag involved, as you can and probably have surmised, actually, we're pretty far along in putting that volume together. Selections have already been made. We're just doing at this point, the logistical things we need to do in order to take the selections and turn them into a book. And beyond that, I'm already receiving material eligible for the 2019 volume.
Wow. That's right. So the one that Phoebe Gleckner is going to be guest editing will include comics that were published between, September 1st, 2016 and August 31st, 2017, right?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay. And the one that, Ben, you pulled together were comics that were published from September 1st of 2015 into August 31st of 2016.
Right, so it's a year basically behind the year on the cover of the book.
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes from autumn to autumn, and then the book comes out the following autumn because it takes about that time to make the final selections and get permission to include the work and get the files and write introductions and lay out the book and proofread it and get it off to press in time for it to appear in bookstores, and even that's a pretty tight crunch.
Ben, do you have anything that you can share with us about what you're working on for possible publication in the months to come?
Just finishing up a large illustrated history book that I'm writing, and a collection. A collection of a strip called Hotel and Farm with a new big story at the end. And I think that's it. Yeah.
And is the
teach
history
a
book,
lot. Yeah.
Is the history book your book on dairy restaurants?
Yes.
Okay.
And I run the illustration program at Parsons, where we do comics and animation and stuff like that. So that's a piece of my time. Yeah, there's some critical work going on there too. But
with these books, the history and the collection that you mentioned, are they going to come out through Drawn and Quarterly?
No, through
Pantheon.
The Pantheon and Schocken. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a part of Random House. Yeah, they're not putting out many comics now, Pantheon, and I think. I don't know if maybe these books were not doing as well as they thought comics should do, but they at least what I've heard is that since everybody else is doing comics, there's no need for them to do it anymore. At one time, they were one of the few mainstream publishers that had a big line of comics. So maybe they feel like it's not a necessary thing to do anymore, which is, I don't know. That seems like an odd logic for a publisher to do anything. There's a million publishers doing everything.
Yeah,
should probably just stop publishing.
Well, I ask about Drawn and Quarterly because they're the ones who put out, I guess, a new edition of Cheap Novelties about a year and a half ago, and I didn't know if there was some kind of arrangement where instead of Pantheon, you'd be publishing with those guys.
No, these are old contracts that I'm fulfilling. But that was one of the best experiences I've ever had in publishing, working with Drawn and Quarterly. It's just not like any other publishing company. They just say, we'll work on this thing until you're happy with it. And I've never experienced that kind of relaxed approach to putting books together. Making it just the way you want it to be. And that's a great reprint. The way it's the packaging and everything. And when they know how to sell comics. If anybody's going to publish print comics, you really have to know who wants these things or where to go to find readers. And they're kind of really good at that. And I think larger publishers have a hard time figuring that out. Their publicity people are looking at a big range of books, And then if they think you're doing comics, they say, well, you go to Comic-Con, or you go to one place rather than understanding where that audience might be. I mean, it's a hard thing to sell, just like anything in the realm of literary fiction. It's not an easy thing to sell, especially now when maybe people have less money to spend on books. I don't know. There's whatever that demographic is that still buys books. They may be more select, or maybe their time is just spent looking at other things. So, but yeah, no, that's. I hope to do more work with them, with Groening-Portal.
Yeah. Well, when your other books come out, Ben, I'd like to have you back on the podcast. And Bill, maybe we can talk to you twice within the same year if we don't experience any delays this coming December with the Best American Comics 2018 volume. Ben, Bill, I want to thank both of you for talking with me for the podcast, and it was great to have you on, albeit a little later than we had originally wanted, but better late than never, as they say, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the focused attention you give to the series every year.
I want to thank Ben Katchor and Bill Kartalopoulos once again for taking the time and being on the Comics Alternative to discuss the 2017 volume of Best American Comics that came out back in the fall from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. You know, I've really enjoyed having Bill Kartalopoulos on the show almost every year for the past several years to discuss the annual volume. This is the first time that I had both Bill and the guest editor for that particular volume on at the same time. I like that arrangement, and I hope that we can do it in a future episode. So later this year, for the 2018 volume, we'll probably do the same thing with both Bill and Phoebe Glockner, whom, as we heard from Bill, will be the guest editor for the 2018 volume. And if you want to find great books like Best American Comics at great discounts, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find incredible specials every single month. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our interview series. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have a Slack channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also listen to us via Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We'll be back with more episodes in the days to come. Until then, take care.